M1 MacBook Air, M2 MacBook Air, or the M3 MacBook Air? Which one is the best entry-level MacBook right now? Should I save a few bucks and go with the older M1 MacBook Air? Should I spend a little more on the 2-year-old M2 MacBook Air? Or does it make more sense to get the latest M3 model instead? So to find out, I did exactly what you would expect. I bought the M3 MacBook Air, borrowed the M1 and M2 models from my friends, and got to work right away. And after about a week or so, I am finally prepared to help you pick the MacBook Air of your dreams with some interesting findings, to say the least. Let's begin. Alright, let me start with the design side of things, and here you are not going to find a whole lot of difference in these 3 generations of MacBook Airs. The M1 MacBook Air does look a bit old in comparison, but despite being a 4-year-old device, this thing is a perfectly well-made machine with a sturdy build quality and everything else. Whereas the M2 and M3 Air are like that Spider-Man pointing meme where you can't tell which one's which just by looking at them. With the M1 Air, you're getting this classic tapered design, but since then Apple has abandoned this design in favor of a more squared off look on the newer MacBook Airs. Besides that, the M2 and M3 Airs are also actually a tad bit thinner and lighter as well, and you also get a MagSafe port on these two, meaning I have both Thunderbolt Type-C connections to myself for data transfer or connecting an external display. Although with all these MacBook Airs, I always have to carry this dongle since I am constantly working with a bunch of peripherals like a pen drive and an SD card. That reminds me, the new M3 Air finally lets you connect two external displays as well, versus how the M1 and the M2 models can only add a single external monitor. The weird thing is, it only works with the laptop lid closed, but if you really need to connect multiple displays to your MacBook Air, finally now you can do that with the new M3 Air. As for the display, the M1 Air is once again outshined by its newer siblings, and quite literally. The thing is, while this guy maxes out at just 400 nits of brightness, both the M2 and M3 Airs can get 25% brighter. So if you're someone who travels or works outdoors a lot, that extra pinch of brightness is definitely going to come in handy. Apple's newer MacBook Airs also have richer colors and punchier contrast, but I don't think that's something most people are going to notice or even care about, especially since the M1 Air has excellent color calibration right out of the box, just like the other two here, with 100% sRGB and nearly 100% P3 color coverage. The one thing that kind of sucks here are these thick bezels, but let me assure you, the bezels sort of melt away once you actually start using the laptop. It's really not that big of a deal. But yeah, the M2 and the M3 MacBook Airs are way too ahead when it comes to the camera. Like, it's not even a competition. Both of them use a 1080p camera, unlike the M1 Air 720p sensor, and the result is vastly superior image quality with better details, lesser noise, and all that stuff. Whereas the M3 Air takes things a step further with improved voice pickup as well. Apple mentions how voice isolation and wide spectrum microphone modes that filter out or enhance background sounds are exclusive to the M3 MacBook Air as well, which is simply not true. Both of them have been available on older Macs with Apple Silicon for some time now, and they work just fine, don't worry. But the speakers on the newer MacBook Air sound noticeably better than the M1 Air. From details to clarity and loudness, laptop speakers don't get any better than this, except on Apple's new larger MacBooks, of course, since those MacBook Airs have more speakers. I don't think I need to be talking about how great the keyboard and the trackpad on these things are either, right? For me, MacBooks have arguably the best keyboard and trackpad experience you could find on a laptop. And I absolutely love how Apple has not tried to mess with the tried and tested formula with each new model. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Simple. The only thing different here is the function row keys on the M2 and the M3 MacBook Airs are full height, unlike on the M1 Air, but that's about it. Alright, so that brings me to the performance. So coming from the M1 to M3 MacBook Airs, Apple's sure made a lot of progress in terms of both computational power as well as efficiency. And the recipe with each new chip has been almost predictable in a way, with more transistors, better manufacturing process, faster CPU, faster GPU, and so on. According to Apple, the M1 chip has an 18% faster CPU and a 35% faster GPU compared to the M1 chip. But Apple has been kind of weird with the performance numbers on the new M3 processor, like saying how its CPU is up to 35% faster in certain games and has 65% faster graphics performance on certain games. So it was not surprising when I found out that my synthetic benchmark runs did not exactly match or come close to Apple's numbers on most of the occasions. Starting with Cinebench 2024, which is a pretty good indicator of a system's 3D rendering capabilities, the M2 Air scored around 10% more in single core and a little over 12% higher in multi-core CPU test. Whereas the M3 Air really started flexing its muscle with a towering 17% lead in single core and roughly 10% better multi-core performance versus the already impressive M2 chip. The Cinebench gives us a pretty good idea of that raw CPU computational power, but what you need to understand is that MacBook Airs are not built to be up for such demanding tasks in the first place. That's why I turned to testing their CPUs with Geekbench 6, whose tests are more in line with what a typical MacBook Air user might do. The results are still obviously and overwhelmingly in favor of the M3 Air in both single and the multi-core runs, but one interesting thing I found is that its CPU also gets the hottest of the three, not to an alarming level or anything, but that's something you should know. And that temperature thing was all the same in Geekbench's GPU test as well. Although I was not really expecting the M3 Air to pull ahead by just a negligible 3% margin against the M2 Air here. So I ran Eugene's Heaven's benchmark next, but the M3 chip was once again not that impressive against its 2-year-old sibling. With a 4% higher FPS than the M2 Air, while the M2 Air managed almost 25% better FPS than the M1 Air. By the way, all three MacBook Airs I have are base variants with 8 gigs of memory and 256 gigs of storage, which also means my M1 MacBook Air has a 7-core GPU and the other two bring an 8-core GPU setup. Next up, I ran a few real-life tests, including compiling larger code base on Xcode and rendering a custom 4K video on Premiere Pro, and I've got to say the M3 Air was quite impressive here, finishing both the tasks convincingly faster than the other two. Apple has also been quite serious about Mac gaming these days, and here in relatively less demanding games like Asphalt 9, there isn't much of a difference. But the M3 chip's upgraded GPU architecture really shines in AAA titles like Resident Evil 4. As you can see, the M3 Air has much smoother gameplay and better average FPS than older MacBook Airs. Those FPS numbers you're seeing are with Metal FX upscaling enabled, but my point still stands. Alright, so what about casual everyday performance then? So if all you do is browse the web, run some office applications and stuff like that, you are not going to have a problem with either of them. Although I must say this M3 MacBook Air just feels a tad more responsive somehow. I can't really put it into numbers, but this is something I've noticed with things like opening a new folder, a window, or searching something on Spotlight, for example. The M3 Air's battery life can also get slightly longer, but don't get excited so fast. Apple promises up to 15 hours of web browsing on all three of them, while M3 chip's dedicated AV1 decoder could spice things up a little bit. In case you don't know, AV1 is basically a video codec commonly used on platforms like YouTube and Netflix that has better compression efficiency than other codecs like H.264, HEVC, and VP9, meaning you will be able to stream higher quality videos even with lower data speeds, and a dedicated AV1 decoder should technically make the streaming experience more power efficient as well. So I looped this 1080p video on YouTube for an hour straight to see if that thing actually works its magic or not, and yes, Apple was not lying. The M3 Air lost just 6% juice during the test, while the M1 and M2 Air spent 11% and 9% charge respectively. To be fair, our M1 MacBook Air is not at 100% battery health, so that number should be a little lower on a fresh new piece. But yeah, if media consumption is most what you do on a laptop, then you might end up with longer battery life on the M3 Air. Alright, so let me wrap up things now, and after all the testing, what I would just like to say is all three of these are absolutely incredible laptops with the perfect blend of power, portability, and premiumness. And if you're on a tight budget, then you simply can't go wrong with the M1 MacBook Air. You just can't. At just $699 in the US or some 70,000 rupees in India, I can confidently recommend this little thing even though it's nearly 4 years old at this point. Whereas it's really the M2 versus M3 battle I guess most of you guys are confused about, and for me it's clear that the M3 MacBook Air is rather a lazy upgrade with not much of a difference over the M2 model. Except for the processor, of course. There's that dual display thing I mentioned earlier. The M3 Air also supports newer Wi-Fi 6E standard, while Apple has used 2 NAND chips for faster read and write speeds on the M3 Air's base variant as well. So if you really want all those M3 goodies and everything else, the latest MacBook Air is a perfectly solid choice. It's just that you're still only getting 8GB memory and 256 gigs of storage for $1,100 or 1,15,000 Indian rupees, and sooner or later that's bound to be insufficient, trust me. The good news is that you can find the M2 MacBook Air at quite discounted prices these days. I've seen it being listed for as low as $849 or 90,000 rupees for the starting configuration, which means you can actually double the memory or storage on the MacBook Air M2 at a similar or lower price than the M3 Air's base model. Plus, you might also see more discounts in the M2 MacBook Air from time to time, just like how we received on the M1 Air over the years. So everybody, that was all for this video. I hope it was helpful for you, and if it was, do let us know in the comments below, and also share this video with anybody who is thinking of getting a MacBook Air in 2024. Saying this, I'm Pratima, and thank you so much for watching.